welcome you all to this edition of Vimarsha Talks. Uh, it has always been our endeavor to get the best of thinkers, experts to this platform and arrange interactions with the general public on issues which are current and which are important for all of us. So today we have Professor Vijay Raghavan, who is the principal scientific advisor to the Government of India. And I want to thank him for accepting our invitation at a short notice. And he has agreed to talk to us today on the COVID vaccine development in India. As you know, COVID vaccine, everybody is patiently eagerly looking forward to the development of a vaccine as the crisis is raging all over the world. So it was a great news when we heard that the Indian company uh, is now starting the trials of this vaccine. But I think a lot goes into the development of a vaccine, and it's not a simple process. And we thought that Professor Vijay Raghavan, who is a biologist of great repute, national and international repute, and also now the principal scientific advisor to the government. He would be the best person to talk to us about the vaccine development in the country and let us know how this whole process is unfolding. Professor Vijay Raghavan has been the principal scientific advisor to the Government of India since 2018 April. As you know, the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor has assumed great importance today in the government structures. And PSA's office also deals with all arms of the government, deals with all the state governments, deals with public, the leading institutions, on all matters which are scientific and technological, and which are of great importance to the country and to the individual. So idea is to take the benefits of science and technology to the people. And that is what PSA's office has been doing. And his illustrious predecessors included Dr. Chidambaram, and I think even Abdul Kalam Azad was also the PSA at one point of time. Professor Vijay Raghavan has been the secretary of the Department of Biotechnology from 2013 to 18. And he has also been the director of the National Center for Biological Sciences in Bangalore. This particular center works under the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, where Professor Vijay Raghavan has worked, and he was instrumental, in fact, in the setting up of the National Center for Biological Sciences. Professor Vijay Raghavan is a PhD from the TIFR, and he earned his BTech from IIT Kanpur. And he has also spent some time at the California Institute of Technology. His interests include his specialization is in developmental biology, genetics, and neurogenetics. So, Professor Raghavan will speak to us about the vaccine. But as I said, I think we have to look at vaccine development in a much broader context. And the context is really the scientific and technological ecosystem, our own capabilities in the country, and which makes it possible for our people to do such work. So as PSA, he deals with policy matters, science and technology policy matters, which is, of course, a very, very important part of the government policies as a whole. As you would have seen in recent times, there's also now a effort to bring out a policy on science, technology, and innovation. And as PSA, he has also been holding roundtables and discussions, etc., both with the experts and with the general public on the science and technology innovation policy in the country. So he's well placed to talk to us about, in general, about how the uh, uh, how the government looks at the new edition of the science technology innovation policy. The Prime Minister has talked about Atmanirbharta, self-reliance. We can quite see that Atmanirbharta is simply not possible unless we have strengths and capabilities in science and technology, research and development, and of course, links between R&D and S&T and the industry. So I think we have been searching for solutions for a long time, but maybe we are getting somewhere now. We have to really become at par with the leading nations of the world insofar as science and technology is concerned, because science and technology underpins every aspect of this country. So it's like the oxygen, I would say, of development. So Professor Raghavan hopefully will touch on some of these issues as well. So I request Professor Vijay Raghavan to kindly make his remarks.
Namaskar. Thank you very much, Arunji. That was a very generous introduction, but also you pointed out the key issues we as a country need to address, even as we try to tackle this particular COVID-19 crisis. I will, in my brief talk, and I'll keep it brief because आप लोगों से सवाल होगी वो आपस में बातचीत करना भी अच्छा है. So I will try to cover two areas. One, broadly, as you pointed out, how science and technology is important for social and economic development, and how it's essential in a country our size. And secondly, how are we dealing from that perspective in India with the COVID-19 crisis, particularly as you asked about vaccines. Let me come to the first part. India has got enormous strengths, which it started putting in place since independence, but it also built several major walls between those strengths, which have to be broken now. India was unusual amongst post-colonial countries in that it invested in science and technology and higher education. Post-independence or just before independence, we started structures like the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, the Indian Council for Agricultural Research, the Defense R&D Lab started a little later, and then we invested in new universities, new IITs, and so on. So this was unusual, and the space program a little later, our atomic energy program before that. So these are incredible for a country which was at independence very deep in poverty and also predicted to fail. Winston Churchill, famous for many things, when asked what he thought about India, he said that the idea of India is something like calling the equator a country. In other words, he didn't think it was a viable country. In that situation, investing in science and technology, particularly in the public sector, was one of a contributor to bring the country together. And that was very, very valuable. The strong public sector resulted in many areas of development, right from railways, heavy electricals, electronics, in a manner which was a pride of any government, any country at that time. But this had a gap between two other kinds. The two other areas, industry and civil society. In terms of civil society, the investment in higher education and in R&D was not matched by a coordinated investment in primary education and in primary health. That was because, not because of a want of doing that, but this slipped in between being state subjects where central interventions were also there. They were sometimes concurrent, or central interventions were minimal. This situation of neither being here nor there resulted in a non-uniform development of primary health, primary care, and even agriculture in its modern aspects. This resulted in the gap between these areas and science and technology, which kept widening. Another gap which widened was that between industry and science and technology. Industry actually chose to abrogate its early development to the government and asked more or less for a command structure which dictated what it should do. And therefore, it survived, but it survived at the cost of innovation and expansion in new possible ways. Over a period of time, this gap between R&D and society and the economy hardened, the walls hardened in a manner where each had its own strengths, but they were not talking to each other. So Indian academia, Indian R&D had extraordinary capabilities. Indian scientists have the ability to understand any problem, but when it comes to doing something about it in the real world, they were hamstrung by the walls which prevented their communication easily with industry. Similarly, industry would of course love to invest in R&D and grow, but they had to contend that other industries all over the world had grown so much that they were investing far, far more. So even if Indian industry had capital post-liberalization, they didn't have risk capital to invest in research. Google, for example, invests in its R&D more than the entire US National Science Foundation. So it's a huge amount of money. So today we have an extraordinary challenge. We have a challenge if we want to have true Atmanirbharata. That means we must be innovative in many ways, and we must have Indian industry investing in research in substantial ways. As I said, industry is caught between a rock and a hard place. And Indian science and technology also needs to break out and grow in extraordinary ways. It's not that we don't have the capability to understand. We understand every area of modern science and technology. But since the Second World War, other countries' investment has grown by leaps and bounds so that the infrastructure needed for both education, training, and equipment in science and technology is many orders of magnitude more than what we currently have. China, of course, has invested enormously, but it's invested enormously in two ways. It's invested internally, but its export of its students to America has allowed China to stand on the foundations of an extraordinary American innovative system, an open innovative system of the highest quality, and get for that foundational price for free all the knowledge which is needed, which can go to China or indeed anywhere else. So there is a double investment in China, within China, and by having a close connection with human resources, a major learning of the latest in R&D. Now, this seems like a situation which is very, very difficult to contend, but fortunately, the world has changed. Science and technology has changed in very interesting ways recently. That allows countries like India with a core capability to catch up enormously. And that's evidenced by the role played by Indians in these kinds of sciences and technology all over the world. What are the features of science and technology which allow us to catch up in these new ways? First of all, the new science and technology today is immensely cyber physical. In other words, there are devices, technologies, manufacturing, all of them which are connected substantially or increasingly with the cyber world. That interface allows something very important to happen. That allows design and manufacturing to be done in great detail at one location, and the details of that manufacturing design transmitted to another location where large-scale manufacturing can take place. Therefore, there's an opportunity for Indian science and technology to leverage its design capabilities in a cutting-edge area, even if it doesn't have the high-end manufacturing. This is evidenced by many Indians working in multinational companies doing this. This is now time for Indians to become entrepreneurs in these kinds of areas and Indian industry to take this on scale. That's likely to happen very soon. So that's one. The second is the role of big data. Big data is becoming present everywhere, and this is both a promise to be grasped and a danger to be avoided. With big data, there is going to be a situation where the analysis of data and feeding back into decision making is going to become all pervasive. This is going to concentrate power in the hands of few big corporations or a few countries. India's ongoing investment and promised increase in the areas of both cyber-physical systems, which I mentioned, and artificial intelligence allow us to come back into the play in these areas. And this will be very important in terms of decision making for artificial intelligence for social good, such as agriculture, health, education, and so on, but also in manufacturing and security and fintech. So this again allows people and countries who have a certain strong foundation, and India has that, to pole vault into the next level of science and technology. The third aspect is about energy and its availability. Increasingly, through a combination of conventional energy sources, nuclear, and renewable energy sources of various kinds, power will be available to everyone in India. That, combined with a revolution which started 10 years ago in the power transistor field, which allows small devices, DC power, to deliver power motors to various kinds of products, will transform the rural economy in very interesting ways. So LED screens, fridges, air conditioners, small vehicles, all of that can be powered in many ways and to scale enormously. So these will transform our economy, and the cyber-physical link and the link to design, right from semiconductors to anything else, will allow us to come back. But this requires a concerted effort, which we must make. This is the quick haul, which requires huge time and investment and will allow exponential growth. In parallel, we need to go for the long haul in bringing back traditional, quote unquote, traditional manufacturing to our country. And these include areas such as semiconductor manufacturing, large manufacturing, manufacturing of equipment involved in textiles, heavy industry, and so on. So that's going to be the long haul, but we must do it. This is not going to be easy because other large economies are not sitting quiet. They would want to make these things cheaper and sell it to us. So this is not an effort which one must hesitate in going into, and we must go for. In that situation, the promising directions come about from our response in the COVID-19 pandemic. It's been extraordinary to see how our industry has come together in the areas of personal protective equipment, ventilator, masks, various kinds of devices, in a manner where our aeronautics industry, our mathematicians, our condensed matter physicists, all of them have come into these kinds of areas, or entrepreneurs have come into these areas too. Just a few months ago, we were talking about how siloed our structures in our academia industry interactions were, and how it is difficult for people to think about doing things rather than being in their ivory towers. I used to joke that many of our institutions of top quality are a short walk from India, but no more. They have actually come together in a manner which is admirable and something which needs to stay on. Now, why did they not come into this kind of interaction earlier, and what will make them stay on? There are multiple reasons, both within the institutions. There is a certain lack of enthusiasm of getting your hands wet. That has been broken down. But there's also problems from outside the institutions where we had restrictions in the way things could be done. Perfect kinds of methodology are the enemies of good, and more flexibility is needed for industry and academia and government and academia to interact. Those kinds of rules and regulations should stay. So that's very good. Now let me come finally now to the issue about vaccines. To understand where we are in vaccine development, we must understand the pandemic, pandemics in general, and what vaccines mean. Pandemics arise in large measure when there is a spillover from a disease which has a bird or some other animal host, and that spills over to humans. Most often, this spillover comes from close contact, and most often, the spillover simply infects the human, and the human doesn't transmit it to other humans. This has been going on for thousands, tens of thousands of years. What humans have done, in addition, is they have had an intensity of interactions with other plants and other animals and birds in a manner as never before. Let me give you a number. 10,000 years ago, humans and our livestock, and I include poultry there, accounted for 0.1% of vertebrate biomass, right? Today, humans and our livestock account for 98% of all of vertebrate biomass. In other words, not only has human population grown, but along with that, we have grown our livestock in enormous ways and we come in close contact. In addition, human habitats have grown and they come close to other wild animals, to wild animals in a way which never before used to happen. In other words, we, over historical time, used to buy an occasional bad lottery ticket. That bad lottery ticket led to an epidemic or a pandemic. But more recently, we've been buying hundreds of thousands of bad lottery tickets. And the more tickets you buy in a lottery, the more likely you are to win. And this is a bad win, and there will be more and more bad wins because of the way we have been behaving in the world. Now, this needs to change. But why does the pandemic happen? Viruses, for example, a major source of pandemics, they reside in these birds and animals, and they cause illnesses in some cases. In other cases, they reside in a manner which doesn't cause any serious illness. For example, coronaviruses infect bats in huge levels, and their high metabolism helps the virus survive. But the bat's immune system is such that it's tweaked to just the right level that it allows the virus to be there, but doesn't allow the infection to proceed. So this is an ideal partnership. Now, as the virus incubates in the bat, hundreds of millions of viruses over time, one of them will be able to infect the bat, but also, just by chance, by evolutionary chance, be able to hit a human if the human comes into contact. If at that time the human comes into contact, this will jump into human. And this can jump in a manner, the change is such that it can incubate in the human and go from human to human. That's what happened in Wuhan sometime in late 2019. Virus jumped from a bat, we think, onto a human, and that human became an agent for transmission. Now, that transmission took place and spread. Typically, when you see atypical pneumonia, it's a cause for alarm, and alarm bells should be raised that this is a potential new epidemic. And it depends on how good a public health system you have, how effective it is, that such alarms are raised and attended. We know what happened in China, that there was an initial alarm raised, but it was not, was viewed with skepticism. That and other delays and other lack of lockdown might have led to global spread at the early phases. Those details will be known as we go along, how much that happened and when it happened, because viruses leave trails in their samples, in the blood samples of people, and we can actually find out when something came and where it came from with a reasonable level of precision. I'll come to that a little later. Now, when viruses spread, when they infect humans, they will cause an immune response. But that immune response takes a few days to kick up by the time the virus has grown in number in the body. If the immune response is strong enough, it can still quell the virus. Otherwise, the virus takes over. But this virus does something amazing. As it grows, it not doesn't inhibit the immune response, but it does something which puts the immune system into panic mode, and the immune system later on overreacts and causes what's called a cytokine storm. So much of the manifestations of later illnesses, later disease we see is because of the cytokine storm. Now, in that situation, what does a vaccine do? A vaccine is of many kinds. You can have a viral particle as a vaccine, or a viral component, a protein, or the viral genetic material, or you can make a scaffold of some other weak virus and put coronavirus to material in it, and you inject that into a human. This results, even though this is inactivated, this results in a response of the body, and then the body is therefore primed in some sense, so that when the actual virus infection comes, it has an immune response already of a certain level, so it can immediately attack it and doesn't allow the disease to spread. This has worked extraordinarily well for many, many diseases. We have eradicated smallpox, we've eradicated polio, there are vaccines for rotaviruses, there are vaccines for meningococcal diseases, and there are vaccines for measles, rubella, so on. So vaccines are amazing in terms of their effectiveness. But vaccines normally take 10 to 15 years to make and take about $1 or $200 or $300 million to make. So a long time and a significant amount of money for one vaccine. The reason for this is vaccines are given to normal people in the tens and hundreds of thousands. They're not given to terminally ill people where you can tolerate side effects because you want to save a life, and it doesn't matter if there are massive side effects. You save the life. With vaccines, you're giving to normal people, and a side effect which is dangerous can be very, very bad. So you have to test vaccines in a manner where three things are done, and these are safety. Is the vaccine safe when injected? Does it have an immune response? And is that immune response protective? Is it effective? So safety, immunogenicity, and efficacy are the three hallmarks of a good vaccine. For a vaccine to be safe, you first test it in various animals. For coronavirus 2, we don't have an animal model, good animal model yet. There's one, maybe a ferret model might work. But the animal tests are done in hamster or mice to see whether there are any serious toxicology problems. Then you go to a phase 1 trial where you test it for safety and immunogenicity in humans that have tens of patients in each site, so a total of a few hundred patients. Then you go to phase 2, which is many more patients, and you look for the immune response. And then you go to tens of thousands of people being tested out, or thousands of people actually, to see whether the vaccine has efficacy. This, as I said, normally takes many years, but you can compress this, keeping into account all the safety and regulatory, to get this done within a year's period or so. And this is tough, and every step has to be still rigorous. This is a major call on our regulatory system and our testing system. Now, to make this go even faster, instead of having manufacturing at the end of this process, what people are doing now is to also in parallel manufacture. This is a huge cost. So imagine you don't know whether a vaccine will succeed or not, but you're manufacturing it and stockpiling it. In case it succeeds, you use it. In case the vaccine doesn't pass the trials, you have to junk it. So this investment costs a lot of money, billions of dollars, and the world is raising this kind of investment. Now, Indian vaccine manufacturers are amongst the world's best. 2 out of 3 vaccines which every child in the world receives is made in India. And they've been typically very good in manufacturing other people's vaccines really well, rather than making, discovering their own vaccines and taking them through the pipeline. But this situation, just as I said for PPEs and ventilators, our companies have been extraordinarily good in that they've also gone in the discovery process. And each of our big companies, many of our entrepreneurs, small companies, and many of our academic labs have taken on vaccine development. So there are over 20 vaccines being developed in India, and two of them, one from Bharat Biotech and one from Zydus Cadila, are gone into phase 1 trials now. So this is very good and very promising, and we'll see how that goes. Indian vaccine companies are also, all of them, are partnering with global companies in vaccine development. So that's good. They'll be doing trials here. Our Department of Biotechnology has put in place both clinical trial platforms. They're putting more of those in place, as well as units which assay the effectiveness of vaccines. So that's something which is very valuable. And manufacturing capacity is being enhanced in all our companies so that they can manufacture even as they test. The government is putting in measures for distribution of vaccines, because unlike other vaccines which you go state by state or age group, like only for children, this vaccine needs to be given to all age groups in all states in a salt and pepper manner simultaneously. First, you would give it to, for example, perhaps healthcare workers and the aged. Then you would give it to others who are in more pressing need, and so on and so forth. And so that'll take some time. But we still haven't got the results from tests of the vaccine from anywhere in the world. We don't know how long the immunity will last. Is it 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years? We don't know how many times you have to give. And we don't know about the disease itself. Will it wane? Will it come again in winter with greater intensity? Or will it change in a manner where you require a new vaccine every year? But I'd like to stop now, and I'll have time for questions hopefully, and say that no matter what the outcomes are, we are in a solid understanding. We have much, much more to learn about the disease, and we're doing that as we go by. But given our understanding of the disease biology and the nature of this disease, a vaccine or a drug is very likely to happen sometime. Whether it's sometime very soon, or will it take a longer time, we don't know yet. But there is certainly a hopeful situation that drugs and therapeutics or vaccines will combine. I'd like to stop here then, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay, for that very informative talk. And you have covered a large number of points, and I'm sure there would be many questions. I already have some questions in the chat box. I will start with those, and then others who wish to ask questions could also just indicate if they wish to just send me a message on the chat box. Major General P.K. Chakravarti has a question about artificial intelligence and quantum mechanics, says the progress is slow, and would it be appropriate to involve the private sector and MSMEs? Your comments, please. Maybe you could start with that.
Sorry. So the question is whether we can involve the private sectors and the MSMEs
in the artificial intelligence and related to quantum mechanics, etc.
Yeah. Now, there is a very important role for multiple levels of manufacturing and industry to get into new tech. Our traditional views of MSMEs some 15, 20 years ago was that they are, have lathes and a variety of milling machines and so on, and manufacture components needed for larger industry locally, sometimes for export. That changed dramatically about a decade ago when MSMEs were the engine of export of components or made components for devices, cars, and so on all over the world. Today, there is a great danger that this carpet will be pulled from under the feet of MSMEs unless they become part of the cyber-physical world. That requires a close participation, interaction of MSMEs with major national laboratories and IT institutions. that siloing between MHRD institutions where current and new technologies, which are IT anchored, come, between CSIR labs where there's extraordinary equipment, and MSMEs which have core capabilities in the industry, those silos broke down during this emergency. They must stay broken and we must come together. Otherwise, we will be in trouble.
Okay, that's good. A related question is about what are the incentives for the private sector to do R&D?
Well, as I said, the incentives for the private sector to invest in R&D they are caught between a rock and a hard place. If they don't invest, they're in deep trouble. And if they invest, they're unlikely to be able to outcompete big investors all over the world. It's a big challenge. There have been, tax breaks and so on and so forth, and those have gone up and down. Those are important matters. But today, there's a pressing need for private sector to invest hugely in R&D. Indian R&D investment by the private sector is about 30% of our total investment. It needs to be 70%, and government needs to be 30%. Very well to say this, but why should you, as a big private sector player, invest in R&D? How can you invest in a manner where you can succeed? So industry is doing two things. One, they've started investing in in-house R&D, and that because of the cyber physical challenge, they're doing reasonably well. I went to Bharat Forge, for example, in Pune, and went to the R&D center. I went to the Mahindra R&D center, the Tata R&D center, Biocon's R&D center. These are all extraordinary. So there are a small number of big players which have invested in R&D. Some of our public sector undertakings have invested. But then we go, after that, it plummets hugely. What we need now is a deep partnership between lighting the dark fiber, which is there in our university and research labs. There's enormous talent, enormous investment, enormous land. These things have to be opened up to the private sector. Unless private sector partners, the MSMEs and the medium industry partner in R&D, which they can, this partnership will mitigate their risk. Unless we do that, we can't go ahead. So our shyness of government agencies in partnering directly in solution need to go. This emergency has again brought out that it is not just a choice, it is a necessity. And this will happen, I'm sure.
Okay. There's also a question about the DRDO. It says that only 20% of DRDO's budget, or about 3,500 crores, is fundamental research. How does one rectify the situation?
The DRDO, Department of Space, and Department of Atomic Energy take up a huge chunk of India's R&D budget. And you're right, a relatively modest part of that budget goes for fundamental research. And overall, our Department of Science and Technology, Biotechnology, CSIR, and others, combined with this, all this investment in basic sciences or research in general goes to about 10% of our laboratory and university system. 90% of our students go to state universities, and 90% of our funding goes to these centrally funded laboratories. Unless this situation in general changes, we are not going to be able to have a volume of quality. To have that volume of quality, we have proposed a new National Research Foundation, which will do two kinds of things. One, which will invest hugely in R&D in our state university system, so that the feeder into high quality R&D is there. You need to do research in college if you want to do research later on well. Some kinds of basic research needs to be done. And the other is big science missions of various kinds of national interest anchored here need to be taken up, including a DARPA model or the DRDO kind of structure. So hopefully it will happen soon. That again was delayed because of this crisis, but I think it will happen very soon.
There is a question about where do we stand with regard to productionizing non-edible biofuels?
Thank you. Now, non-edible biofuels, the sources are clear and the technology is clear. So, for example, we have good technology for making biofuels from rice bagasse, sugarcane bagasse, from rice stubble, and so on and so forth. The problem is not the technology. The problem is twofold. One is the supply chain logistics to collect all this biofuel in a place where the economy of manufacturing, the price comes down. Secondly, supposing you can make, for example, biofuel, that pricing of that biofuel also needs to be competitive. Right now, it is not as competitive as other fuel, even fuel which we import. So that's something which needs to start changing. That's more a problem of, as I said, logistics and supply chain management, and that will, when addressed, will bring the price down substantially.
Okay, thank you. There is a question. There is some speculation that COVID-19 shows signs of genetic engineering. Do you believe this virus evolved 100% naturally?
Well, there are two kinds of genetic engineering, one which nature does and one which humans do. Now, let me tell you the way nature does, and that is it really makes millions and millions of changes over a long time. But it's not just making the changes, it makes those changes in a manner where you select for functionality. So, those kinds of changes to do in the laboratory about 5 or 10 or 15 years ago, I would have said to make that many changes and test would be very difficult. Today, the ability to make many kinds of changes are there in the laboratory, no doubt. But that ability then goes to a next step in the laboratory. What would you? I'm not going into why you would do this. You would look at, let's say, the pathogenicity in a cell, and you can select for something in a cell. But whether that will function in a different manner in a bat, we don't know. That will take, again, it's not easy to do that at all. And then whether that, when it infects humans, whether it will transmit, again, is not clear. So while one can theoretically construct scenarios of genetically engineering the virus, it seems very unlikely by multiple arguments why it happened, not just for the arguments I gave, but if you look at the sequence of the virus and compare it to wild predecessors, which you can go back right from 2013 and check, and even earlier now, there's a clear chain on how it could have happened in the wild. So that makes the wild change more likely than the laboratory. There's another possibility that there were animals used for research in the laboratory. They were already infected, and they transmitted to a laboratory worker who then transmitted elsewhere. That is a formal possibility consistent with a model of natural change techniques, but we don't know about whether that will happen.
Okay. Another question about the vaccine. You mentioned vaccines take 10 to 15 years to develop usually. In light of that, what do you think about the recent letter from ICMR that was made public that mentioned they expect the Bharat Biotech vaccine to be out by August?
Well, it's now 10th of July, and let's say that the phase 1 trials start today, right? That in 12 sites. And they start in all the 12 sites simultaneously, unlikely. But let's assume that they start together. The phase 1 trial involves an injection, then another injection after 7 days, and then an examination after 14 days, and then looking at the results of that before deciding. So after 28 days. So that kind of a timeline for phase 1, which is about safety, right, is still a very long period. And as I said, you have to go to phase 2 and phase 3. So the timeline for a vaccine, and if you look at the global ones, to go into phase 3 trials is several months after the phase 1 trial. So the Bharat Biotech vaccine or the Zydus Cadila vaccine will go through a rigorous evaluation process, which will not be compromised, but As the ICMR clarified, the regulator, and ICMR is not the regulator. The regulator will have ensure high speed without compromising quality, and we're likely to see if the phase one succeeds, it will go on as fast as possible.
Okay. Now you have 5 questions coming from Ambassador D.P. Srivastava. Dinkar, go ahead.
Professor Raghavan, thanks for a very lucid presentation, and it's a learning experience. Flowing from what you mentioned about Chinese students, we are slightly behind the curve because both US and EU have tightened restrictions on not just technology transfer, but admissions in universities. But still we can learn something from Chinese example. In their case, the students come back. In our case, the students go abroad for finding a job. And the difference lies in the fact is that Chinese government sponsors these PhD students. Now, can we do that on a large scale? That is number one. And one example, how the Chinese had penetrated universities, Dr. Joshi, Murli Manohar Joshi, who was a physicist and HRD minister, he had come to Brussels with a delegation of 5 Indian scientists. His Chinese counterpart came with a delegation of 200 Chinese scientists. So they had put their people in literally every major European universities. But let's focus on the students. And this is the right time because of tightening of job situation. Even if some student decides to jump the bond, he may have to come back because there are not enough jobs there. The second part is contract research. It is very heartening to hear from you that government is thinking in terms of DARPA model. I had tried very hard, and your predecessor many years ago, Dr. Chidambaram, who was also chairman Atomic Energy Commission, he mentioned to me that he could not go beyond getting 25,000 euro sanction for Indian research in Frank Hoffner Institute. But if the government is revising that, that's a very good thing. I hope it comes on very quickly. Third is how
you have to compress your questions. Yeah.
Okay. How do we improve PSU's record in R&D? BHEL has an excellent record in turbine production. They have not designed a single turbine. They don't even have a turbine test bed. Fourth is the nuclear power. You mentioned that because of the climate situation, this is imperative, and also to reduce our import dependency. We have a VIF task force report. It requires just about 20,000 crore per annum investment, and the report was prepared by some of the veterans like Dr. Kakolkar and Dr. Jan. And this is all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Let me answer your question. China has not just given fellowships to students so that they learn and come back. That is, the baseline part. But what has happened is something which is more extraordinary, either by accident or by design. Innovation, learning, knowledge, discovery come from huge investment over decades and in an open system where ideas clash with each other. That kind of a system of investment in science and technology is there in Europe and America. It is absolutely stunning to see what China has done in a relatively short period in what is clearly a closed system. How did that happen? That happens because you have a huge investment in your closed system in translating the ideas. You have ideas from within, no doubt, I'm not belittling. But you have access to ideas from these open systems in enormous ways of a scale which should have taken you several decades, maybe a century, to get back. So China's return is not just in terms of students going and coming back, but something far more from the students from the open system. Now, what should India do? India should not, in my view, imitate China in that model for two reasons. One, from the reason of correctness. It is not correct to partner with others in a manner where you go beyond a certain level of established norms in relationship with intellectual property and knowledge transfer and so on. So it has to be a partnership and not something where you give in money and you take something in an unbridled manner. That is feasible because India has got an enormous respect in the world. Indian diaspora has shown how much it contributes to countries where it goes, and that partnership can be very, very valuable and readily done. The second reason is economically, the kinds of investment China made in that, in sending students abroad. But now, more recently, over the last decade, China has been funding American science in an extraordinary manner. It has not only funded people in the Chinese diaspora, but people all over the US, for example, in enormous ways, and having them, help train Chinese students. So that's something which is perfectly legal, maybe, but it is not something which India can do on that scale. So India must adopt a more uh, different partnership model, which yields much more, and that is feasible. And India should do that in a manner where opening up our systems to people from the US, Europe, Australia, Japan coming in for intellectual partnership, so that few of those partnerships can have large impact here. And our students working, our faculty working by remote partnerships on large scale can help transform our science and technology and also help the global change in science and technology for the better. Now, I mean, you mentioned about BHEL, I agree. Our public sector undertakings, again, were remarkable in their early days. Now they truly need to reinvent themselves. BHEL is trying to do that. Others are trying to do that. But this is a big challenge. There are many strengths they have. So without throwing the bathwater, the baby with the bathwater, those reforms need to come. And they too involve a combination of design. With the BHEL, for example, we are working on turbine design, and they've actually come up with an ultra super critical turbine design, which is amazing. And so therefore, those kinds of things are likely to happen once there is synergy and encouragement.
Okay. So the next question is, yeah, where is the question here? Yeah, we hear of mutations. Now, the question is, do vaccines address all variants at one go, or do multiple vaccines have to be developed to tackle each mutation?
Well, so far, so what happens with influenza is we need a new vaccine every year because the domain of the virus which the vaccine attacks keeps changing every year. So one year it's like this, another year it's like that, another year it's like that. So you need a new vaccine each year. Both those vaccines are readily manufacturable. When the virus epidemic starts at one end of the globe, you can quickly make the vaccine at the other end and have it ready. And so that goes around the world. It doesn't look like coronavirus is changing in that manner. We don't know yet. So hopefully a single vaccine will last us, but we don't know it.
Okay. The question is about whether we have human resources needed to develop and produce vaccines at the scale that we require.
Well,
we have the human resources.
Yeah, vaccines are very expensive. Human resources are an important component, no doubt. But the kinds of safety standards and manufacturing standards it's required and the scale up of that are enormously expensive. So human resources we can manage. Our top vaccine companies are good at training people and they have enough people, they can get more. But the challenge is going to be really in setting up the manufacturing because that's very, very expensive.
Okay. Another question about the vaccine. What are the pathways by which Indian COVID vaccine candidates development can be speeded up?
There are some parts which can go in parallel and other parts which cannot. There are some parts which can be shrunk and other parts which cannot. So to summarize, what needs to be done in parallel, you do. That's monetarily wasteful. That's a risk you have to take. What you cannot do in parallel, you have to do in series. You can see whether timelines can be shrunk. And what are those things? First of all, you need to test whether the vaccine is safe or not before you go to human. You cannot just put it in human in case there's a massive toxic reaction. So some kind of a cell culture study of that, some modest animal study is necessary, but that can be shrunk. Typically, it would have taken a very long time, you can shrink. Phase 1 and phase 2 trials look at safety in human and immunogenicity in human. They can be combined and you can reduce the number of people and you can do that simultaneously. So that can save some amount of time. Phase 3 requires a very large number of people over a very long time. You can shrink that to a smaller number of people over a small time. So all this can take about, you can go from a 5-year, 10-year period, you can bring this down to about a 12, 13, 15-month period. But that's enormously expensive because massive parallel processing needs to be done. Now, while doing all of this, you can also invest in manufacturing, which is again very expensive. Manufacturing in bulk is expensive. Then stockpiling, which is putting them into vials, again is a big expense. And having all the delivery chain ready simultaneously is again expensive. All this can be done, but they come at costs.
So what is a realistic time frame in which a vaccine would be available in India, you think?
So the key word which you're using is available. Now, before I give the answer to that, I'll say there are 5 things we should do. Face masks, hygiene, hand washing, and so on, social distancing, contact tracing, testing, and isolation. These we will have to do. If we do this, we can not only flatten the curve, but we can crush it. This is very tough to do in real life with the economy open, but we have to focus on that. That should be our job. Now, then, if and when there won't be one vaccine, there'll be one vaccine, there'll be a better vaccine, there'll be another vaccine, they'll start coming. If today there is a vaccine which can be used, to scale that up for human use will require some time to ramp it up. Let's say you already have ramped it up. You're going to have something like a few million doses available for everywhere in the world. World organizations will decide the priorities. They will give it to the most vulnerable. Then they'll give it to others. Then they'll give it to others. So these kinds of vaccines will take over a year to roll out. So availability is spread out over a year or two. So we must keep on these 5 things so that as it becomes available, it starts getting used in a sensible manner. Very difficult to switch.
Okay, we have now 2 interventions, one from Ambassador Satish Chandra and then by Dr. Gulshan Rai. Ambassador Satish Chandra.
Thank you, Arvind. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Firstly, big thanks to Dr. Vijay Raghavan for an excellent expose, which was extremely instructive, and you more or less completely answered one of my queries, though I will pose it. But first, a couple of observations on what you said. And I would just like to make the point that while in our initial perhaps 15 to 20 years, the state did make huge investments in higher education and science and technology, and the fruits of it which we still enjoy. My feeling is that in subsequent years, this wasn't followed up to the extent it should have been. The second point I would like to make, and this is from personal experience when I was in the States, in the government of India, and that is, like China, we too have a very strong diaspora in the scientific community in the United States. And efforts were made, I'm aware, in the 70s, very strong efforts to tap into the knowledge acquired by that diaspora. I don't think it has been sustained as much as it should have been, because we could have reaped some of the benefits which the Chinese are reaping. The query that I had, and this has troubled me for 2 decades, because we had done a study on this in the NSCS on what happens if we have a severe pandemic, and this was done around 2003, 2004 in India. And we were taking the possibility of the avian flu becoming human to human transmittable through a gene shift, which can happen anytime. The mortality rates are, as you are aware, around 60%, whereas the present one has a mortality rate of about 3.5%. And our fears at that point in time were that should that happen, you would lose half the world's population in super quick time unless you had a vaccine. And therefore, the imperative requirement of having the capability of developing a vaccine very, very fast in a few months, 6 months, 8 months, maybe maximum a year, because you would then otherwise lose your population. In this case, we are extraordinarily fortunate because this pandemic has a relatively low mortality rate. Also, this epidemic, we had the genome sequence relatively early in the game. I understand around January, the genome was passed on, which is a very important element in making a vaccine. And therefore, I don't know how you have mentioned and you've put in place excellently the problems in fast tracking it. But I think we need to think about methodologies of having a very, very quick vaccine production, because if you have a pandemic with a very high mortality rate, you're looking at disaster, real disaster. So that is the point that I wanted to underline. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think both important observations. As I said, there are some aspects which theoretically can be fast-tracked. Other aspects, even theoretically, are not possible to fast-track. Vaccines, certain, because of the scale of their deployment, unless the risk of not giving a vaccine is very high, such as with Ebola, where even if it's a vaccine which is otherwise not safe, you would give it because not giving a vaccine is very, very risky. You would typically have extraordinary safety studies taking place. Drugs, on the other hand, antiviral drugs, are much more rapid to make, but they're much less likely to be effective. And so widespread approaches to generic antivirals is another route, and people are taking that. I don't have time now, but there are also global coalitions which are investing in making vaccines against many kinds of diseases which are bubbling and at very early stages in the possibility that they might become pandemics. These again require insurance investment because many of them will fail. So for example, these coalitions are making vaccines against MERS, against Nipah, against Congo hemorrhagic fever, and so on, which have not yet pandemics, but in case they become pandemics, chikungunya, in case they become pandemics, then they'll be useful. But that's again, vaccine companies go at a loss when they do this, and that loss has to be met by public support.
Dr. Gulshan Rai, briefly, please.
Thank you, Professor Vijay Raghavan, and I must thank you for the wonderful exposition as well as your candid answer. Now, my question is follow-up of the answer which you gave about the DRDO and the space and the atomic energy. there is a, I mean, and there was a question on the artificial intelligence and that kind of a technology and quantum kind of a computing or quantum technology there. Don't you think that with the so much innovation and expansion going on, there is a need to have a national security, a national strategy on the research and development, which define the priority? Because I find that, I mean, neither we are spending too much on the basic research, and nor we are spending on the application kind of a development, technology development. We are neither here nor there. So, what's your thinking? Don't we think that we need a appropriate national strategy on the research and development, defining the priority, and then involvement of Ministry of Electronics should be more in particularly applications like artificial intelligence, such areas.
Well, thank you very much, Gulshan. This is very valuable, very clearly put. The challenge is the following. We are now, for example, developing a science, technology, innovation policy. It will be ready in a month or so. Now, the problem with these policies and previous ones is they are a wish list or a desire of what needs to be done. Our hope this time is to link that wish list to the gearbox, to the transmission, and to the wheel. Unless that connection is made, will constantly be having an engine of policy going at high speed about what needs to be done, but not connected to the transmission and to the wheel. Now, the connection to the transmission and the wheel requires a dose of realism, but that dose of realism must include the following, and that following is the investment in the future, whether it is in terms of our environment or whether it is in terms of cutting edge technology. We must put aside, even in very difficult times, investment for the future. And that is what we're trying to do. For example, in a family, when money is short, when food is short, when shelter is short, when the home is leaking, parents will still keep education of the child, which will pay off 10 or 15 years later, as a possibility in mind. If that is a possibility, unless you're below a certain level of poverty where even that is not a possibility, if educating a child is somewhat of a possibility, that becomes very important despite all the difficulty of the work. In a similar way, these are the areas where, as a country, we must not hesitate to invest, even though the returns will be a little while longer. The longer, the further away the goal is, the longer the journey is, it's all the more reason to start now. We did that in space for a long haul. We did that in atomic energy. We're doing that now in many sectors, in AI, in quantum computing, and in electronics. But we must resolutely start and keep going and not slip. China did that 25, 30 years ago. Korea did that 30 years ago. It's a short time. We must move ahead, and I think we are now gathering that momentum. That momentum has been spurred by this pandemic, which tells us all the more reason that we have to go.
Thank you. There is a question about R&D efforts in traditional Indian medicine systems to develop a cure for COVID-19. And in fact, I would like to add that why COVID-19? What is the status of R&D in Indian medicine systems generally?
Well, in some time around, I think 1500 or so, in Dutch Malabar, the governor Van Reed, he interviewed all the Vaidyas in Kerala and sat with them as a collaboration and wrote down every single important plant, drew a picture of the plant and of the Vaidya and of the active part of the plant. About a very large number of, then this was a 12-volume study called the Horus Malabaricus, which Professor Manilal of Kerala University translated from Latin to English. And he got the Padma Shri last year for that. He's in his 80s, but amazing man. But the lesson from that is, systematic documentation and testing has resulted in many, many of these plants and their active ingredients used in modern medicine. Such a systematic approach is needed today for Ayurveda and for modern medicine to work together. That needs to be done on scale. We have a Ministry of Ayush, but that ministry needs to work with the health ministry, with our labs, and our labs need to reach out and work with them so that there is a middle ground which is met in terms of testing and doing. The Prime Minister said some time back that both systems seem to be stuck in their own ways without seeing another perspective. That is natural and it's difficult to see in these different kinds of systems other perspectives easily. But other countries have done that. We are now, and we are doing that too. We're doing that more because the drug controllers allow a phytochemical pathway is different for these kinds of drugs. China has done that for medicine. So Chinese traditional medicine is largely animal-based. Indian traditional medicine, Ayurveda, is largely plant-based. There's an enormous opportunity, both in terms of validation and in terms of a global market and effectiveness for studying Ayurveda better. We must do that. So there are some drugs, by the way, which have general antiviral properties in other contexts, which are being tested. There's one major one which CSR is testing with in collaboration with IGIB, an institute in Delhi of the Department of Biotechnology, and with a pharma company. So let's see how those go.
Great. There are some more questions. I hope you're not tired. If you're tired, please let me know because the questions keep coming.
No, I'm fine. I have to go for a meeting, but I can take a few more questions.
Yeah, we will finish at 6:30, so we have a few minutes.
Right.
These questions, some questions are on COVID-19 race, etc. You have already, I think, answered them. Yes, there's one question about will entrepreneurship by youngsters, especially in biomedical engineering, be encouraged with grants and other financial aids? You may also like to touch upon the startup scene here, because when I speak to some people, and while there are a lot of policies, etc., but on the ground, I think startups are still facing a huge problem. And in fact, some of them are writing to exalted offices like yours for meetings and some help, etc. But I think there is no system here, and many of these startups are, disillusioned. And this COVID has hit the startup scene also quite badly.
You're absolutely have a good point. The startup ecosystem has received a major thrust over the past few years. Now, this has resulted in a large volume of startups. Many of them are very, very good. The very good ones, good meaning they're successful because it's again a lottery. The good ones have taken off really well. Partner, and I'm not talking about the e-commerce ones. I'm talking about others also. So that's good. But there are many amongst those which haven't taken off, which have enormous potential. They require a market ecosystem and a connection to industry. And that connection needs to be much stronger. Being a good startup is not enough. You have to have strong academic links as well as strong industry links. And we're trying to push that by forming city clusters of laboratories and entrepreneurs in a big way. The next point is investment and mentorship. Those are a big challenge. There are extraordinarily attractive sites all over the world which people are attracted to, companies are attracted to. So if we have to grow, then we have to find different kinds of investment over here. And that remains a big challenge, but I hope we'll be able to overcome.
Okay. What is the government doing for encouraging biomedical engineering entrepreneurship? Will there be a boost expected post-COVID?
Well, 2 points. One, I think broadly for any kind of entrepreneurship in deep tech, government should be enabling rather than in each area trying to micromanage encouragement. That said, what we did about 3 years ago was to, in partnership with the government of Andhra Pradesh, start the Andhra Pradesh zone. And that was led by an extraordinary person, Dr. Jitendra Sharma. And what he did was, instead of asking, how can I support the import of a large equipment? He broke the equipment down into components and said, look, I can make 95% of these components here. I'm going to get this other 5% which I have to import, which is proprietary. So let me get done with this 95. Let me import that other 5% now, and then let me try to make that over here. And these range from MRI machines to ventilators to all sorts of major biomedical equipment. The Andhra Pradesh MedTech zone is now making it. The government has decided to have 5 more such zones, and they will happen soon, I'm sure, despite these tensions. So we're going to see a great thrust in the game.
Okay. There is another question about to fulfill the safety criteria, do we simultaneously develop a counter in case of some serious side effects during the trials?
It's very difficult to say what one can do. That's why, patients, people participating in trials, rather, are always under very close hospital observation. Because when there's any problem in a vaccine, then they can be attended to. We know what are the kinds of problems which can be there. One, it can be have toxic side effects, so there are drugs to attend to that. The other is there's something called a enhanced antibody response. You have the virus, the vaccine injected, but if you already have been exposed to the virus, you might have what is called a cytokine storm or an enhanced response, which can be dangerous. There are ways of dealing with it. So those are risks. That's why it's called a trial. But there are very strong ways by which one can minimize that risk.
Yeah. Okay, I think we'll just come to now end of this. There are a few more questions, but some of these you have answered in some way. And maybe a few questions can be emailed to you and you could probably answer. So
Please.
just give you a
Thank
little
you.
respite from answering these questions. But I have one question, and this comes from our report, the VIF report on science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and innovation in Indian universities. We have not talked much about universities. And Professor K.K. Agarwal, I think I saw him just now somewhere. He is the author of that report. And we also had a very big discussion with about 40 vice chancellors as to what is the status of STEM education in the country. And the short point was that the status of STEM education in the country requires a huge boost, and our universities are simply not well placed to deal with this the STEM education. And now we have this COVID, which has more or less disrupted the education. So if you have this R&D and you have these great programs and policies, etc., but the base of the pyramid, which is the education, and not just in the universities, but also in schools, where I think you yourself in one of the places had mentioned in one of these seminars earlier somewhere, that in school the science and science education is no longer that popular, and schools also have got disrupted. So we cannot really become a big science power unless our base is strong and it is based, and science and technology education is there. So how do you link up this education? And then, of course, it's also the question of skills, which is also very important, whether it's vaccine development or any other part of science that you do. So what attention is government paying to the education system and popularizing the STEM education and improving the STEM education in our country? So that is my question.
This is a very important question, and you can invest how much ever we want in deep tech and AI and so on, but unless the foundations are strong, the flow of talent into the well of knowledge will not be there. And for that, you have to invest right from primary education, primary healthcare. If you have primary healthcare and primary education taken care of, then the rest of the things flow much more easily. So that's a very important area, and there's a big thrust in that area. But in addition, we need to invest in learning bilingually, science and technology particularly, but anything else also. There is too much value being placed on being able to know things in English. That is, of course, very difficult for those for whom English is not the first language. But more fundamentally, it leaves out an enormous number of people in our talent pool away from science and technology. That is not correct, and it also denies opportunity. So translation of the best science and technology text into your native language so that you can open a page and read it in both You see a video talk in a accented way, which you cannot follow the accent in English, but if you have the text in your own language simultaneously there with a time clock, it'll be awesome. So these kinds of measures are being taken up by in collaboration with the Ministry of IT and MHRD, and I think that will be truly transformative in our education system. The education system today has got very ambitious and talented children, and getting the tools to them with a human touch and a human interface, not just by technology, can be very transformative. That's the thrust of the new education policy, and I'm sure it'll have impact as we go along.
Yes. And just one small question. You know, we have been talking a lot about increasing the expenditure on R&D. We are probably 0.7 or 0.8. I think it's called JERD. Is there any realistic chance of doubling it to 1.6% of GDP or 2% of GDP? And you know, you mentioned China and many other countries. I think they have much larger expenditure. Is your office engaged with this particular aspect? And also, if you could briefly tell our viewers here, what does the PSA office do? I mean, you know, and what has been your priorities in the last few years?
So about the R&D investment, the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, the PSA's office, our science ministries have prepared documentation on a roadmap to increase this. Particularly, the Economic Advisory Council has worked with my office to do this in a very detailed manner. So, incentivizing R&D investment by industry and by states are the additional new points, in addition to increasing government investment. Now, that would have been on track, and I think would have been steadily increasing. But this crisis does set us back, but we will pick up. It's okay. I mean, there are crises, you have to deal with it, and you can't say that I will wait for it to go ahead. But so we'll get R&D investment, states investing in a manner where they see value for the return, and increased government investment will start happening. My office's role is principally, if you want to put it in one word, is synergy. The Prime Minister said in a speech to civil service entrants some years ago that the problem is that if you have to have a sapling to be planted and to grow, if you have a department of digging a hole, department of putting the sapling in a hole, and a department of filling up the hole, they can each do their job separately, but unless they do it in synergy, the job will not get done. There's no point in digging the hole one place, putting the sapling in a second place, and filling up a hole somewhere else. So these coordination, you have deep capabilities in what you want to do, but we must be in step together for everything. That is a challenge because being in a silo gives you extraordinary expertise and learning and understanding at a depth which others can't get. And if you start by interacting everywhere, you may not have that depth. But we have over decades now got that depth. We have got that understanding in different areas all across the society. This is the time to do the inverse. Take a problem and solve it and get everyone in. That's the role of our office, to take problems and solve them, no matter where the solution lies, and get the synergy to do so.
Okay, I'm sorry, I have just one follow-up question. The government had announced that I think it was 16,000 crore rupees they would earmark for the health sector because of this COVID, etc. Now, what percentage of it is going into the health R&D?
You know, there's been a dramatic change in attitude during the crisis towards the definition of R&D. Previously, R&D meant what you allotted to a research agency like the ICMR or the Department of Biotechnology and so on and so forth. Today, R&D is interwoven into the job of getting anything done. For example, if you look at the nutrition mission or if you look at the telemedicine mission, we are finding that there is a demand from the people who are implementing them to get R&D right from the basic level to the applied level. So the fraction of that which you take for R&D is a two-component thing. If you factor in and get in R&D early on. If you were to invest, let's say, 100 rupees, I would wager that you can do the job for 80 to get R&D at the early stage. If in doing that for 80, some of the 20 goes into a foundational R&D effort as part of this partnership, then it's a win-win for both. That's what I see a very welcome sign happening now. That stays on. In other words, focus on solving the problem and bringing in, whether it's the Jal mission or the health mission, every aspect into that. Then you will find enough for mathematics and for basic science or material science. Well, all of that enters into this also, in addition to what must be done to enhance funding.
Great. I think we will end it here. It's now 6:30. And I want to thank Professor Vijay Raghavan for his wonderful presentation and also patiently answering so many questions. And I think there are many people are threatening to send you emails and eliciting answers. But I think we would be very happy to have maybe some roundtables with you on some of these issues that agitate us. So I hope it will be possible to remain in touch with you. And
Absolutely.
I would request the participants to raise their hands and acknowledge. Let's acknowledge Vijay Raghavan's wonderful presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you.